My name is Jennifer Simmelink. I'm a doctoral student in the School of Social Work in my second year, and this project that I'm going to talk about tonight was funded this past summer by CURA, but it's an ongoing project that I'm still working on, so most of what I'm talking about tonight is actually a little bit more recent, just because it's a little bit more interesting. So the project the purpose of the project is to develop a culturally informed mental health screening tool to use with refugees when they first resettle in Minnesota. So I'm going to give you a very basic introduction to our background to refugee resettlement in Minnesota, but when refugees first resettle in Minnesota, they have, within the first 3 months of entering the United States, they have a series of public health appointments that are mostly medical based, and so what we're looking at is implementing a screening tool for mental health. Currently, refugees who resettle in Minnesota are not screened for mental health issues, and so we're implementing a culturally grounded screening tool within that first 3 months of resettlement. In 2008, 1,200 refugees, a little bit more than 1,200 refugees resettled in Minnesota. They come from 20 different countries, but primarily the top 4 countries are Burma, Karen from Burma, Somalia, Bhutan, and Ethiopia, so Oromo from Ethiopia. Refugees, when they first resettle anywhere in the United States, but particularly in Minnesota, face significant barriers to stable resettlement, issues like lack of English language skills, lack of adequate housing, transportation, lack of appropriate services, and then also mental health. By definition, refugees are fleeing cataclysmic events like war, torture, trauma. They've often experienced rape, witnessed the murder of their family members, been imprisoned, tortured in prison, and so they're at increased risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and other issues related to war, trauma, and torture. And mental health issues often exacerbate some of the other barriers to stability, like learning English language skills. We've heard from a lot of refugees in this research project that sitting in the middle of an ESL class for an hour and you're interrupted by your cell phone ringing and it's somebody from back home talking about a family member that's just recently been killed, or you haven't heard from a family member in years and then you get a phone call from them. It's really difficult to concentrate and difficult to sort of focus on resettling in the United States when you still have this ongoing connection to the country from which you came. So in 2009, last winter actually, the Center for Victims of Torture started a needs assessment project in the East Metro area of the Twin Cities, and the goal of that project was to assess in the East Metro area. So they interviewed mainstream community service organizations like public health clinics and social service agencies, community-based social service providers like ethnic community-based organizations, members of refugee communities, cultural leaders from refugee communities, just to kind of find out what kinds of services are being offered in the East Metro area that torture survivors and trauma survivors might be able to access, and how well prepared do community organizations feel. Do they feel like they're prepared to offer services to torture survivors or war trauma survivors? And what came up over and over and over out of that needs assessment, out of those conversations, was that there is a lack of culturally appropriate mental health services. So a lot of community-based organizations were seeing refugees who were saying, we have this increased risk for PTSD, we're experiencing this emotional distress related to war trauma, but there's nowhere for us to go to get culturally appropriate services. There's also a real lack of assessment tools. So most of the assessment tools that are used in the United States to assess mental health or mental distress were developed and tested on a predominantly Western white male population, and so they have little correlation to refugee communities. Their cultural experiences with trauma and their cultural expression of emotional distress is very different than what's experienced here. So a screening tool doesn't necessarily work when you sort of translate it over to use with refugees. And a really brief example, the current screening tool that's used when somebody applies for welfare here, for TANF, it asks a question, do you feel blue? Which for most of us in the United States, do you feel blue makes a lot of sense. I feel sad, I feel depressed. For a refugee, thinking, no, I don't feel like the color blue, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so even translating tools that have been tested in the United States doesn't make a lot of sense, and statistical reliability and validity are really sort of difficult with that. So what we wanted to do is to develop a culturally grounded mental health screening tool for youth with refugees who are first resettling. We kind of wanted to answer these two questions. How do different cultural groups describe mental and emotional stress? And how do we communicate across cultures in a way that makes sense? So if we're going to sit down and ask somebody from a conflict area, how do we best communicate with them, and how do we ask questions that make sense to folks? So what we did is did 12 focus groups, and we're actually still just finishing up the focus groups right now. So some of the findings that I'm going to talk about in a minute are really recent. But we did 12 focus groups with communities who have been arriving in Minnesota in the last year. So predominantly those 4 groups that I had talked about before. We did a naturalistic inquiry approach guided by ethnocultural and participatory action research frameworks, which means that it's all ethnographic. So we did interviews that were interpreted, and then they were audio recorded and transcribed, and then we did a grounded theory analysis of the resulting hundreds and hundreds of pages of data that came out of that. And the process was influenced by CBT, and I guess I didn't mention this earlier, but Center for Victims of Torture, after the needs assessment program, then partnered with the Department of Social Work and the Department of Family Social Science and the Minnesota Department of Health to sort of run this project. So at this point now we're working with multiple people across multiple communities. So 12 focus groups with members of 4 communities, and we ended up doing groups with men, women, and youth. And the youth focus groups have been, for me, some of the most interesting data has been coming out of the youth groups, because for a lot of these groups, particularly the Karen and the Bhutanese, folks have been in refugee camps for 10 to 20 years. So when you're talking to an 18-year-old who just came to the United States, they grew up in a refugee camp. So their experience of war is completely different than their parents. They might have heard about the war, fleeing the war. They might remember from age 0 to 5 what it was like, but their experience has been a refugee camp, which isn't necessarily better than fleeing a war zone. There's a lot of trauma, a lot of torture, a lot of oppression that goes on within refugee camps. So anyway, it's been really interesting. So anyway, I'm going to talk about some preliminary findings. Basically what we did with the data that came out of these focus groups is created a pilot screening tool. So we have an 18-item screening tool that we actually just finished about 2 weeks ago. And we're working with leaders from each of these ethnic communities to talk about the screening tools themselves and to refine them. And then we're going to pilot test them sometime this summer with community health clinics in the East Metro area, actually. So I could talk for another hour about the findings that came out of these focus groups, but I just wanted to mention a couple of different findings that were really salient for all of us that were on the research team. So first of all, there were a lot of culturally specific words and phrases that were used to describe mental health symptoms. And one of the things that I think for us was really interesting is that a lot of people who have sort of attempted to do a culturally grounded mental health screening tool tend to use a one-size-fits-all. As long as it's not Western, it's cross-cultural, which we found incredible differences between the Bhutanese groups and the Somali groups in terms of words that they were using, or even ways that they described the range of mental health symptoms. And so some of our Somali focus groups talked about the difference between really severe biologically based mental illness and mental illness that's really related to trauma suffered during the war, but the Karen community had a little bit different sort of polarization of mental health issues. And so what we found is that we really need a different screening tool for each community, which isn't necessarily feasible, but I think it's important for public health professionals to be aware of sort of the